There you go. Okay. Hi everyone, thanks for joining me today. So I sent out a poll last week on my Instagram story asking if people would rather my next YouTube video be about a sketchbook tour or if it should be about digital illustration. And a large majority of people said that they wanted it to be about digital illustration, so that's what we're going to talk about today. It wasn't until after I sent out the poll that I realized that I'm not really sure what a YouTube video about digital illustration is actually going to be about. So I've been thinking about it. And I've decided that I think for today I'm going to just start with the basics, talk about what even is digital illustration, what does that mean, what kind of tools I use, what are the pros and cons, and then I'm going to talk about my process personally and what I do and how I create illustrations digitally. So I think this will be a good starting point for a lot of people who maybe don't even know what digital illustration is or what that means, or maybe just people who aren't, who are artists themselves who work more analog, and so give you a little bit more of an insight of what the digital illustration means and how that works.
So what is digital illustration? Personally, I would describe that as an illustration or a drawing where the completed or final version of the illustration is created digitally. So this could either mean an illustration that was completed entirely digitally using an iPad, computer, or something like that. Or it could be an illustration that started traditionally and then there were significant changes made digitally. So like scanning a piece of art that was made physically and then putting it in the computer and editing it to the point where it's mostly digital at that point. Here are a few examples of some recent illustrations that I have created entirely digitally on my iPad using the Procreate app. Everything from the sketches and thumbnails to the final drawing and coloring was made completely on my iPad. All the textures and pencil marks were also created on the iPad, and all of the lettering as well. This Emily Dickinson quote that I have here started off as a drawing in my sketchbook that I then scanned, edited, and colored on my iPad. The original drawing was made using pens and markers, and I then changed up the colors and some parts of the lines to make the piece something that I could then sell as prints in my Etsy shop. An example that I have that I wouldn't consider a digital illustration are these sketchbook pages that I made. I scanned them in and I edited some smudged lines or fixed some colors that didn't come out quite right so that I could print them to sell. But besides that, I left them as is. I didn't fix anything else. I just edited the errors of or fixed some of the colors that didn't come out quite right through the photograph. So yeah. Those are a couple of my personal examples of different versions of digital art. Alright, so let's chat a little bit about materials. After working digitally for a couple of years now, I mostly use my iPad and an app called Procreate. My iPad is a 12.9-inch version. It's a little bit bigger than my old one that I used to have. You can see a little bit different sizes here. I really like this size mostly because it is a nicer way to visualize what my prints or projects are going to look like in real life. So working on things like magazines or selling letter size prints on my Etsy shop, this just helped me visualize it a little bit better. And I use the app called Procreate, which is just a $10 app for an iPad. It's very similar to Photoshop in that it is able to send out different types of formats, so PDF, Photoshop, JPEG, that kind of thing, so that's really nice, and it's a lot less expensive than Photoshop as well. But yeah.
Digital illustration is a great way to work, and it's the main way that I have chosen to work, and I have really enjoyed it, but there's still some pros and cons to it. It's super easy to set up, and there aren't a ton of supplies that you have to bring with you, so I just bring my iPad, my pencil, and that's it. But that being said, there's still just something really great about using markers and paints, and they're all really satisfying to work with. It's like the difference between a Kindle and a real book. When you go to the bookstore and you can flip through all the physical pages, it's really pleasing. But when you have an ebook, you can bring thousands of books with you. You don't need a book light, and some of them are even waterproof. Books and ebooks are both different, but they also both have their own purpose. In the end, digital might be a little bit more cost effective, even though you have to pay quite a bit up front. Every artist also knows how expensive paints, paper, and pencils can actually cost. Digital art is also great for working with short deadline projects, such as when you're doing a project for a magazine where you might only have a week or two to send in your sketches, your finals, and then get approved. You don't really have time to sit around and wait for your paint to dry, scan all your work, and then if there are any last minute changes, you have to go back and paint it all over again. But on the other side, digital art is reversible. There is an undo button at the ready. However, this can also lead to the mindset that leads people to overwork a project, try to make it perfect. But sometimes messy lines and nice textures can actually make something a lot better. Lastly, there's a bit of a learning curve to digital art. Even though it feels like you're working normally, the texture of the screen is really different, and you have to remember the shortcuts on the keyboard, and you have to learn how to use the layers and create a completely different workflow. Essentially, you're working on a whole new way to draw. Alright, so after all of that information that I just gave to you, let me tell you a little bit about my process and how I work. So like I mentioned, I do a lot of my drawings fully on my iPad now. Everything from thumbnails and sketches to the final drawing and all of the coloring. And I think I finally found some brushes, which are basically just textured tools that you can use on the program that I really like. So with my drawings, I tend to start with a sketch and then draw over it with a little bit more detail and then work on my final drawing on top of that. So here you can see that I get some of the finer details figured out before I put in the time and effort to actually draw the whole thing out. So then I start to work on this tight sketch, which has all the details and textures. So for this piece, I wanted to try to work on some hand lettering as well. So you can see that I start to sketch that in here. That will help me figure out where I want some of my characters to go, and that way they won't compete or overlap with each other too much. So after I get the drawing done, I often do a little value study in black and white. So this helps me to figure out the mood for the drawing. This one I knew I wanted it to take place in the daytime and have a kind of fantasy vibe. So then I began to play around with some color, and this I still find kind of difficult. So I like to look at a lot of inspiration and play around with it a little bit. So for this one I went pretty bright and colorful to look a little bit more like kid-friendly and like a children's fantasy book. So like I said, I knew I wanted it to take place in the daytime, so I really made it pretty bright and colorful in the landscape there. I also try to find some colors for the characters that can help them stand out against the background. So like the little girl with her pink dress and the red dragon at the top there. I began to add some more detail to the color. I messed around with some light and shadows, and I add some texture into the building and the landscape and try to figure out a way to make sure everything looks kind of realistic but also more hand-drawn. So after figuring out the colors and how I want it to be shown, I play around a little bit more with the details and textures, the way the water should look, and that kind of thing. And lately I feel like some of my digital illustrations can sometimes end up looking a little bit too computery, so I've been experimenting with some more pencil and paint textures to make it look a little bit more hand-drawn and not so obviously digital. So When I was working on this piece, I actually had a meeting with my local critique group. I'm part of the SCBWI group, and we all get together a few times a month to chat about what we're working on and give each other feedback on our projects. So I would definitely recommend this to people. They should definitely get feedback from other artists or friends or join a group like this because it's really helpful. So after that meeting, they suggested I fix a few details in the back, and I should add a few more magical creatures. So you can see here I start to add this little octopus or kraken or something, whatever he is, the little griffin, a satyr in the window there, and then I eventually add a little giant in the background as well with his book. And I think that really helped to add a bit more to the piece. So yeah, I was really happy with that. I wanted this piece to be for my portfolio, so I decided to practice some more hand lettering and get that all set up. So it would look like a book cover that you'd see in a children's book, and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out for my first time trying that. So here is the finished piece. Thank you all so much for tuning in and watching this with me. I hope it was informative and gave you a little bit of a look into what I do on the other side of the computer and social media. As always, I'll put links to my social and website below, and I will also put a transcribed version of this video on my website if you would rather read it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to my channel for future videos.